DIO and Cars. Without a doubt, these two for the most of JoJo's Bizarre Adventures history have been considered the two biggest bads the Joestar family has ever fought against. Now, literally decades later, there are arguably more powerful villains who have made appearances in the series, but if they will ever reach the iconicity factor that these two reached is yet to be seen. Both of these characters also act as a representation of sorts of their own respective eras of JoJo, the Hamon era of parts 1 and 2 and the Stans era of everything that came after. Even official, though non-canon products seem to obsess over comparing these two to each other, books like George Joestar spicing it up by giving both of them godlike powers to boot. Both of them have claimed to be the strongest being in existence, but of course, only one of them can be correct. So today, let's talk about DIO versus Cars and why it isn't even close. For this video, we'll be talking about both of these characters at their absolute peak within canon. High DIO, the one who drank Jonathan's blood, and Ultimate Cars, the one who transformed after donning the stone mask. As always, a question arises when scaling JoJo characters who do not interact within the same part. How do we compare them? Do we compare them with inverse logic, creating a linear scale of their abilities to each other? Or do we use cross-verse logic, calculating the feats that they have done individually and judging them that way? Believe it or not, Araki is remarkably consistent with the cross-verse scaling of JoJo, as aside from some very obvious exclusions, most feats, even very early on, have remained pretty consistent. Thus, I will be discussing both cross-verse and inverse feats so we can have the most general understanding of how both of these characters compare to each other. Scaling both Cars and DIO's power is relatively straightforward. For Cars, he has enough feats nearly back-to-back in the final chapters of Battle Tendency just to directly scale his feats, and with how the world is directly stated to be the strongest and most powerful stand in Part 3, we can just scale it above any other feats done by automatically inferior stands. The first important feat for Cars is actually a durability feat, as he managed to survive the explosion of this airplane directly into lava, and only seems to take damage from the lava itself. Though, at worst, this means that Cars could regenerate from any of the damage that this explosion did to him. Either way, this explosion is encroaching on city block levels of power. This level of overall strength is generally supported for Cars, given how he was capable of casually dismembering Joseph's body, and Joseph was not instantly crushed by being suddenly launched into space by a volcanic eruption, which would take building levels of durability based on the force of gravity. This is remarkably consistent for normal humans in JoJo to be this strong, and for examples of this, let's move on to DIO. As mentioned previously, the world is the strongest stand in Part 3, only weaker than an Angry Star Platinum once it had developed its own ability to stop time. This means that both stands should be stronger than the likes of Wheel of Fortune and Dark Blue Moon, who through their own power and just physical strength did building level feats. This is also pretty consistent with later stands who should be retrospectively weaker than the world, like Killer Queen and Stone Free, who also have around building levels of power based on various statements or attacks. With how most stand users can at least survive a single punch from one of their stands, having close to building levels of durability is pretty consistent. With the world being unquantifiably above this level, it makes absolute sense that his stand is capable of punching straight through stand users instead of just pummeling them like weaker ones can. So when it comes to pure power and durability, Cars has a slight edge over DIO because we can prove he's 3 block level, while DIO just might be. Speed in the JoJoverse is very, very weird for the level of physical power that the series displays, at least in comparison to other manga. While the JoJoverse power on average is quite low compared to something like Dragon Ball or Naruto, their speed puts most other manga to shame. There are just like objective light speed statements for a lot of stands like Hanged Man and Star Platinum. There are a bunch of calcs ranging from tens to hundreds of times faster than light, especially in Part 3. So we're just going to take the middle of the road and say that the world, who is also stated to be the fastest stand, is FTL. While that would sound like an easy win for DIO, Cars also has FTL feats himself. He reacts to a point-blank ultraviolet laser before getting his ultimate form and could disappear within flashes of light generated by his own body. So purely from feats, both of them should be extremely close in speed. For cross-verse speed scaling, the only character that both of them have actually interacted with is Joseph, and both of them are just portrayed to be faster than him by a good margin, with any instance of Joseph reacting to them being very conditional. While Joseph blocks Cars' Hammond attack, it stated that the red stone moved on its own because it reacted to Kars' Hammond, and while old Joseph potentially reacts to a sneak attack from the world, it's unclear when the world decides to not actually throw the punch in comparison to Joseph's movement. If anything, this just shows that they are indeed just at a similar speed tier with each other. Now we get to what really determines this battle, and that's the hacks that both of them have. When it comes to pure basic abilities and their physiology, Kars has Dio beat. In terms of vampire physiology, he's essentially 2 tiers above what Dio should be capable of, not only being a Pillar Man, but being an awakened one. This would just generally give him better and faster regeneration than Dio's, and he's the only one who's going to be worrying about sunlight. But that's not Dio's win condition, it's the world. With Kars not being able to see stands and Dio's ability to stop time, Kars is suddenly at a substantial disadvantage. While I do think Kars is certainly smart enough to potentially put together a general idea of what Dio is doing with his high IQ and enhanced senses, I think it's unreasonable to say that he could 100% deduce the rules of how stands work or what exactly the world is doing. With the world, Dio should be easily able to make up for any stat deficiencies and easily beat down Kars, right? Not exactly, because from the very beginning, there's been one factor that makes their stats almost irrelevant when comparing the two of them: Hammond. While fighting Jonathan, Dio doesn't even want to punch him with his stand, even in time stop, because Joseph has Hammond wrapped around his body. This means that Dio thinks he would be hurt by it and maybe even killed. Meanwhile, Kars is radiating 100 times the amount of Hammond that Jonathan did in his prime, so much so that it melts normal people who even touch him. And this is why this match isn't even close. Kars simply needs to walk up to Dio and let Dio attack him, and the so-called strongest stand user is dying on the spot. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to comment and subscribe and tell me why I'm wrong in the comments down below. See ya.